All right, class, welcome back to the final lecture of History 17 in our 8-week course. And this is Chapter 14, Part 2. And we're going to complete our discussion of the Civil War. So make sure before you get started that if you have a pen and paper nearby, you're writing down notes while I'm lecturing, and you're also writing down any questions that you might have for me. So here are our key terms. Okay. So we're going to begin by talking about African Americans in the war. And we had already talked about the first couple of years of the American Civil War in our last lecture. And right at the beginning of the war, in fact, the first year of the war, there was a general in the Union Army by the name of Benjamin Butler who decided that he, sort of on his own, was going to consider African Americans contraband of war. And so he would take escaped slaves and basically treat them as property and put them to work for the military. And this was in non-combat positions. So this would be like, you know, helping to build roads or set up camp or cook or those types of positions in the military. And this will be followed by a congressional act called the First Confiscation Act. And this is basically just the Congress, the US Congress saying, yes, this is okay. We're going to do this moving forward. So that was happening. Then you started to have Abraham Lincoln talk about colonization. That, it's often thought that Abraham Lincoln sort of imagined this biracial society in which African Americans and whites would live side by side. And in fact, that's not at all what he envisioned. He talked a lot about taking formerly enslaved people and moving them back, either back to Africa or to Haiti or maybe to Canada. So he wasn't very enlightened in the way that he envisioned the the end of slavery in many ways. But I always like to mention that because I think that that's an important thing to realize, that there was a lot of controversy and hesitation about integrating African Americans into society after the slaves had been liberated. So you have a second confiscation act of Congress in July of 1862. And again, you're getting more slaves being moved into the military. Um, and basically, this said that all slaves of disloyal owners in the Union occupied territories, as well as slaves that had escaped. So this is expanding the First Confiscation Act to say, if you are somebody who is disloyal to the Union and you own a slave and you are in Union occupied territory, then we are going to confiscate your slaves. So that's the Second Confiscation Act. The Emancipation Proclamation goes a step further, basically saying that all slaves located within states in rebellion, and at the time that the order was issued, it was 10 states that were currently in rebellion, would be free. Now, Abraham Lincoln looked at this as a military necessity because they needed soldiers and they knew that African Americans would join the military, and they did in very large numbers. As you can see under this picture here, 179,000 Black soldiers will serve in the Union Army, and 38,000 of them will die by war's end. Now, one of the things to realize about the Emancipation Proclamation is that it did not outlaw slavery. It simply freed the slaves that were in the states in rebellion. It also didn't settle any issues about the rights of freed people. It didn't give them citizenship. It didn't allow them the right to vote. It didn't make any clear guidelines about whether or not they could own property. I mean, there was absolutely nothing there. So it was a temporary executive order It wasn't a final solution. But the Emancipation Proclamation is issued on January 1st of 1863, and that will lead to over 100,000 freed people joining up for the Union Army, where they will make the ultimate sacrifice. Here you see a picture of people, families, and it looks like leaving plantations and trying to flee to the Union lines. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the South in the war. As the war begins to progress, you're going to start to see more and more discontent in the South. The first is The first reason why is that the South was really suffering economically. Soon, their currency, they had Confederate dollars, and their currency was becoming really hyperinflated, meaning it had basically no value. Um, Also, in the South, you're starting to see the effects of the naval blockade. And the naval blockade is becoming more effective over time as the Union is building up their Navy fleet. But um, one of the things that really kind of puts the South over the edge is the fact that they will issue the first draft in American history because they were having such a hard time keeping their soldiers. There was a lot of problems with desertion and things like that. So in April of 1862, the South issues a draft order that says all men between the ages of 18 and 35 had to serve for the Confederate Army. And this was a huge burden on the male population, as you can imagine. And they took everybody, even if you didn't have to prove that you were 18. So there were kids that were serving that were younger than that. But they basically took anybody. But the draft made it mandatory for men between the ages of 18 and 35 to serve. And that really upset a lot of the women who stayed at home and watched their sons and their husbands in some cases go off to war. And as I mentioned, the economic issues, it really comes to a head in the spring of 1863 when a bunch of bread riots break out in southern cities because people are so angry that they can't feed their families. And so women are storming the stores in Richmond, Virginia. That's the image that you see there. And they're going and they're busting into bakeries and they're basically looting in order to get the food that they need and the supplies that they need to take care of their families. There's a 10 Confederate dollar. Okay, so things were a little bit different in the North, not quite as chaotic. Politically, there was a lot of legislation that was being passed. There was a Legal Tender Act of 1862. That's where we get our greenbacks and the dollars that we use today. They were first issued in 1862. You have the Pacific Railroad Act, also 1862, that basically laid the foundation for the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Um, the National Banking Act, which created or reinstituted a central bank. The central bank had not been in existence since the time of Andrew Jackson, who basically forcefully closed the central bank. So this will be the beginning again of a central banking system in 1863. Also in 1863, the Homestead Act that was encouraging people to move into the Western territories by offering 160 acres of land grants west of the Mississippi. Women were hard at work in the North, even though there wasn't a lot of fighting and action that happened in the northern states. There was still a lot of action when it came to manufacturing and pumping energy into the war effort. And so women were contributing in pretty large numbers to that effort. Um, the North also issued a draft. It came after about a year after the draft in the South. This was in March of 1863. Now, the Northern draft was a little bit different than the Southern draft in that if you did not want to fight and you had the money, you could pay $300 to be exempt from the draft. This, of course, was very upsetting to a lot of the poorer populations, and it will lead to a really violent event that takes place in the summer of 1863 called the New York City Draft Riots. This is a 4-day long riot throughout the city, and when it was all said and done, over 100 people were killed. Many of them were African American. The draft riots were instigated for a couple of reasons. One was the fact that a lot of people were feeling like this was a rich man's war, right? That the Northerners who could afford it would pay the exemption and not have to go and fight. And then, secondly, a lot of people were really resenting the fact that this war had it looked like this war was more about slavery than about anything else, than about reuniting the Union, and a lot of white Northerners really resented the idea that they were going off to war and being forced to go off to war because of the draft to fight against slavery. And that might be surprising to a lot of people, but not everybody in the North agreed that slavery had to come to an end. I mean, white supremacy was a real issue in both the North and the South. So these Northerners came to be known as Copperheads, and these were the Northerners who supported an end to the war. They wanted reconciliation with the South. They didn't like the fact that the war had become about slavery. So if you link into this YouTube clip, you will see some information about the New York City draft riots. The woman who you see pictured here in this photograph is a woman by the name of Clara Barton. She will be responsible for founding the American Red Cross after the Civil War. During the Civil War, she worked as a nurse on the battlefield, and saw really the need to organize a emergency medical response. And so the Red Cross actually already existed in England at the time, but the American branch of the Red Cross will be established by Clara Barton after the war. Okay, also in 1863 is a real famous battle, the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a 3-day long battle, and it is a massive battle with tons of soldiers. You can see General Lee's army invaded Pennsylvania with 75,000 men. This is the farthest north that the war will get during the course of the Civil War. He will be met with General Meade's forces, and they will meet at this place, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. 3 days of fighting will follow, and if you follow this first YouTube link, you will find detailed descriptions of the battle at Gettysburg, including some very famous parts of the battle, like Pickett's Charge. And those are all things that you can take a look at on your own. But basically, what happens is after this 3-day long, heavy battle, tons of losses, General Lee will be forced to retreat. And he retreats on July 4th after losing 28,000 of his men. And this was a major devastation. Also, on the same day, just coincidentally, on July 4th of 1863, Union forces will successfully take Vicksburg, Virginia. And this becomes a critical strategic win for the Union, who will then be able to completely control the Mississippi River Valley. But probably what is most famous about the Battle of Gettysburg is something that actually happens after the battle in November of 1863, when Abraham Lincoln visits the battlefield to commemorate it for um, a cemetery for veterans. And so if you click on that second link there, that will take you to a video talking about the Gettysburg Address, which is the famous speech that Abraham Lincoln gives on this battlefield in November of 1863. It's a very powerful speech, even though it's very short. And it's also carved on the side of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. So click on that link, take a minute to listen to the Gettysburg Address, and then move ahead. So, because there had been some critical victories in the West, there was no need to have a really strong military presence in the West. So, the president orders that Ulysses S. Grant, who had been out west, and his officers move to the east and start to systematically attack the Confederate forces. Um, Abraham Lincoln was famous for saying, I need Ulysses S. Grant. He fights, right? That man fights. He got the reputation for being extremely tenacious in battle, not giving up. So he thinks maybe he would be the perfect general to basically end this war. It turns out he was right. Um, Ulysses S. Grant has another general that works alongside of him, and that is William Tecumseh Sherman. And Sherman is ordered by Grant to go down and attack Atlanta, Georgia, and then move his troops to the coast, and then move up the coast from there. And so Grant will take charge of the Army of the Potomac. He goes over to Virginia. General Sherman will be put in charge of the Army of the West, which he will then march towards Atlanta, Georgia, and he reaches there in November of 1864. There are 62,000 soldiers under Grant's command, or excuse me, Sherman's command, and they are just so sick and tired of this war. And so they attack Atlanta. They basically burn Atlanta to the ground. And then from there, they move on to Savannah, Georgia. And as they're moving across this 285-mile journey overland, they are just laying waste to everything. This is a military strategy called a scorched earth campaign, where basically the military just destroys everything in its path. It destroys buildings, it takes prisoners, it kills people, it does whatever it needs to do. It's called a scorched earth campaign. By the time Sherman's army reaches Savannah, right there on the coast, you can see it on the map. Basically, uh, everybody has fled Savannah, Georgia. And Sherman decides that he's going to spare Savannah because, it's such a pretty southern city and he didn't want to see it destroyed if it wasn't necessary. So he sends a famous message to Abraham Lincoln that he has basically got a Christmas present for him, that he has taken not only Atlanta, but also Savannah, and that he will be on his way up north. He also has confiscated a whole lot of cotton and other types of goods as he was moving along with his scorched earth campaign. So if you click on that link, you will learn a little bit more about Sherman's march to the sea. And there's William Tecumseh Sherman. Okay, so this map is showing us the progression of the Union forces. You will notice the blue lines with Sherman moving his army from Nashville to Atlanta, from Atlanta to Savannah, and then moving his forces northward. You will notice that up here, the Battle of Gettysburg, which we mentioned up there in Pennsylvania, and then eventually we're going to see Grant get put in charge of the um, Army of the Potomac, and he will engage with General Lee at the Battle of Petersburg, which is basically on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia. And you'll notice the dates at the Battle of Petersburg all the way from June of 1864 to April of 1865. So this is the very end of the American Civil War. It's this massive siege of this town of Petersburg, and the Union is trying to break through and get to Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the Confederacy. So once Grant's army is able to basically break Lee's army at Petersburg, Lee is then forced to retreat, and Richmond will fall in April of 1865. Lee and his forces will actually flee the scene, but Grant will pursue him, and when he pursues him, um, Lee recognizes that it's done, that the Confederacy basically is going to be forced to surrender at this point. And so General Lee will surrender to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865, and this will officially end the American Civil War. There will be some sporadic fighting that will continue in some remote areas like Texas, like people that didn't get the memo that the war is over, but basically the war ends April 9th, 1865. And the terms of surrender that Grant allowed Lee to have was actually very moving because with an unconditional surrender, you are allowed to, if you are the victor in an unconditional surrender, you're basically allowed to confiscate anything you want from that other person's army. And in this case, Grant decided not to do any of that. In fact, he basically gave Lee and his men some food so that they could, because they were very short on supplies. He allowed them all to keep their weapons. So these were all things that were very unusual, but it was in an effort to kind of bridge this gap, bring the country together because General Grant recognized that it was going to be a long road to reconciliation and to recovery from this horrific war. If you click on that link, you will be able to watch a video on the terms of surrender that Grant offered Lee.